At james.crid.land, on the Radio Today podcast, and on your favourite podcast app. I'm James Cridland, the radio futurologist. This week, will podcasting eat radio?
Well, good afternoon and good day to the hundreds of you around the world who have tuned in to today's broadcast of the Podcast Consumer 2018.
Last week saw Edison Research release its latest podcast consumer data. It's a good piece of research that is the most quoted data about podcasting. And with over 10 years of data, it's also a good tool to help watch trends. As part of the data release, Edison Research published an updated share of ear study, which showed the amount of audio that Americans put in their ears. Radio is 58% of all audio, that's AM, FM, and Sirius. Podcasting is just 4% of the total. So it's tempting to assume from this 4% figure that podcasting is tiny. The research excitedly claims that podcasts' share of ear has doubled in 4 years, but the cynic might dismiss this by saying that twice nothing is still nothing. In most cases, however, radio listening is a habitual and automatic thing. Start up your car, and you start up your radio too. The radio alarm clock wakes you up with the radio. It's altogether too much hassle to spend time producing playlists for the office or shop, so radio typically wins there too. Podcasts are different. They're deliberately chosen and requested, and given that they're speech rather than music, they typically have the full attention of the listener. They're mostly enjoyed on headphones rather than speakers. It's a very different listening behaviour overall. But the share of ear study is more revealing when it comes to podcast listeners.
That number includes, obviously, all the people who don't listen to podcasts, so that's going to average that number down. But if we just look at podcast listeners in share of ear, then we see a very different story. In fact, podcasts are the number one source of audio for podcast listeners. Now, that may sound like it's a foregone conclusion, but it's not, and it hasn't always been the case. AM/FM radio used to be the top source of audio for podcast listeners, but over the years, this has crept up with podcast consumers. Now, if you are a podcast consumer, you spend 33% of your audio time listening to podcasts. AM/FM radio is in second at 25%, and then there's kind of a virtual tie here between streaming audio and owned music.
So this does appear to show that podcasts have a negative effect on broadcast radio listening. As we discover more podcasts we like, it appears to take a hit on radio consumption. Now, some radio groups have a strategy here: sell ads on both. And that's certainly the case in Australia, where Nova have partnered with Acast and Southern Cross Austereo represent Podcast One properties. Last week, the US's Wondery partnered with Global's DAX to sell ads on Wondery podcasts in the UK. And some radio groups also have a content strategy as well. Australia's Hamish and Andy finished broadcasting their afternoon drive show on Southern Cross Austereo stations last year, but continue to be available as a podcast through Podcast One. Shorter pieces of content from broadcasters like news bulletins are available on most smart speakers. The UK's Global is producing best-of podcasts for example, listeners of The Chris Moyle Show on Radio X. Australia's Nova Entertainment are encouraging and monetising new podcast-only shows. However, I can't escape the feeling that many radio companies are yet to take advantage of podcasting. There are radio studios to hire out, content makers to nurture, commissions to earn on ads and sponsors. Reformatting broadcast audio for podcast use is also an opportunity, easier if it's pre-produced, of course, but producing good, local, non-broadcast content that might attract a different audience might also work well. There are real opportunities in podcasting, both in additional revenue and marketing, but also in future-proofing the radio business as a whole. So I'd be keen to learn which radio businesses have properly grasped podcasting, and to understand why many haven't yet taken the plunge. You can find my weekly newsletter at james.crid.land and daily podcast news at podnews.net. And until next time, keep listening.